Today we're going to talk about a very important topic, abuse of domestic labor, and specifically with respect to foreign workers, either documented workers or could be undocumented workers. Those people still have rights and very important rights. And I am here joined today by a very fine lawyer, Dev Kayal. Dev is an immigration lawyer. And Dev, it's great having you here. And can you just tell us a bit about what you do?
Okay, thanks, Morris. First of all, thank you for the invitation to your podcast and to talk about this very important topic about abuse of domestic labor. Now, in terms of my immigration practice, I've been practicing immigration since 1993. I help people I help foreign workers get green cards, work visas. I go to immigration court. I'll go to federal court. So I do the whole range of immigration.
Excellent. And Dev, I think what tends to happen, the typical fact pattern, maybe somebody comes here with a B1 or B2 visitor's visa, has a passport, is seeking asylum. Can you talk about the relationship of all of those factors and how they end up being abused as a domestic helper in somebody else's home, for example?
Sure. Often what happens is the foreign worker will come here, or the immigrant will come here, and they end up staying. Sometimes they get work visas, but typically is a U.S. Citizen or a U.S. green card holder, somebody who's a U.S. national, ends up hiring them for a live-in domestic help. And the foreign worker, starts working. Typically she doesn't know what her rights are, what is the minimum wage, what are the work hours. Does she work 40 hours? Does she work 50 hours? And then they usually have an oral contract or an oral agreement. Sometimes the employer is even paying them, but then asking them to pay them back for expenses like their travel money or their food and lodging. And so what ends up being is that the domestic worker is pretty much working for pennies.
It sounds a lot like slavery. They're coming from a third world country. They're trying to get here. There were all kinds of stories of this in the early 1900s. People from Ireland, from all countries in Europe, coming here, just living in horrid conditions, working 24 hours a day at these sweatshops. And it seems like this is just another form of that. Am I off the mark here? Or?
Well, no, I think you're actually on point because, Morris, you might know about that federal law on forced labor that actually I think is captioned slavery, peonage, and forced labor, and that it's exactly that comes out of it, that it is a form of forced labor.
Now, it's very important because you should check your state's overtime laws. Okay, now I know, for example, in Maryland, all right, there is no exception for domestic work. There's no exception for childcare. Your job here is to watch my kids 24 hours a day, and you're required to sleep with the kid. You're required to wake up for nightmares, whatever it is. You can do that if the employer is paying the domestic worker overtime for that. But that's very important. So people should check their state law or find out one way or another what their rights specifically with respect to overtime. And the penalties with overtime are pretty stiff. It's time and a half, it's attorney fees, lots of things. Any of these fee-shifting statutes where the defendant has to pay the fees of the plaintiff are frightening to defendants. Dev, let's talk about another situation that comes up that I've heard a lot, and that is where the owner or the employer basically confiscates the employee or the domestic worker's passport and holds it, I guess, for what reason are they doing that?
Yeah, Morris, that's a really good, important point. In fact, our federal immigration cases and other cases are replete with these kinds of examples where the employer is withholding their passport and other important immigration documents. Now, the sole purpose of doing this is actually forcing the forced labor. If the worker does not have their passport, does not have their work papers, does not have their visa papers, they literally cannot go outside of the house. And federal courts have actually found that quite often, that this is exactly the intent and purpose of confiscating someone else's government documents.
And it's basically a situation of, we're going to pay you pennies, we're going to hold on to your passport, and if you complain about this, you're never getting it back. And then, I've heard of this in countries on the other side of the world, where certain domestic workers from places from Africa who are trying to escape or just trying to get work basically have this happen to them in other countries in the Middle East and places like that. And wow, to think that goes on in the United States, that's really terrible. So what would you recommend someone do if they're in that kind of situation? If they're listening to this podcast and they're saying, hey, I'm here, I may be undocumented, I don't have my passport, they're paying me pennies, are they allowed to do this? What are the things you should be doing to kind of protect yourself?
Well, I guess, you should call Morris, because, he knows how to help you. First thing you want to do, whoever you talk to, is first try to get to understand what your rights are. Okay? First get to know that, then you can make an informed decision whether or not you should, get a lawyer, somebody as competent as Morris, to take up your case and see if you can get the money that you're owed, get the documents that belong to you, and whatever other rights that you have as a worker.
And then I would say, when you've done all that, you want to talk to somebody like Dev, who's going to have all kinds of advice for you on issues of just general immigration, of how does this affect my whole immigration situation, because that's going to be important also. But this is a very, very important topic, and we've got some cases out there on this. And if you are in a situation like this, call my office. And the contact information is listed below at the end of the podcast. And don't waste any time, because you shouldn't have to live like this. Our country is really better than this.